Hello, everybody. Welcome to this online seminar, Thinking and Researching Urban Futures Amid the Pandemic. I am Simone Tulumello, research fellow at the Institute of Social Sciences of the University of Lisbon and member of the Urban Transitions Hub, which is one of the organizers, and together with the ISOP Young Academics Network. And I'm just saying that I'm very grateful to the AESOP-YAs for having decided to organize this with us. As many of you will know, this online event is somehow a small replacement, so it cannot definitely replace a workshop, an early career workshop in urban studies that was planned to take place in these very days here in Lisbon, which we decided to not organize this year for obvious reasons. And we decided we couldn't hold it presentially for obvious reasons. And we decided that we didn't want to host an online event because the model of the workshop, which is, for those who know the AESOP-YAs, is partially inspired by the PhD workshop of the ISOP. For that style of workshop, presence is extremely important. So we postponed this for here, and that's why many of you are the participants of that workshop. Hopefully you're going to be able to join us this year. And on the suggestion by someone, we decided to organize a small online event discussion to start meeting each other and tweaking the topic toward this conjuncture. And so we asked Babalik and Gareth Millington, the keynote speakers and mentors for the workshop, to give us 2 short keynotes focusing on what it means researching, thinking urban futures amid a pandemic situation. So the idea is having a quite informal discussion. We asked Elle and Gareth to give short keynotes, somehow 20 minutes, in order to have plenty of time for discussion. I will soon introduce briefly the Gareth and Ella plus Olivia and Andrea, Olivia, Bina, and Andrea Pavoni, who accepted to moderate the 2 sessions. Just 2 words, the urban transitions on the 2 organizing groups. Urban Transitions Hub, for those who don't know it, is a research hub on urbanization and transition, which is based at the Institute of Social Sciences of the University of Lisbon. Olivia, who's here, is one of the conveners of the hub. If you are interested in knowing what we do and what we don't, I'm just dropping here the link. And I'll give the floor to Rozana, who's gonna tell something from the ISOP Young Academics.
Thank you so much, Simone. So hello, everyone. And I know as many of you are joining from a few different time zones, so good afternoon, good morning, good evening, respectively. So I joined Simone in welcoming everyone and his team, of course, in welcoming everyone to this online seminar, speakers, mentors, participants, and the wider audience. So I'm Rozana Darwich. I am an architect, urban planner, holding a PhD from the University Paris-Sorbonne and the Lebanese University. And I am a Young Academics coordination team member, and I'm representing the Young Academics in the preparation of this seminar. So as Simone said, this workshop, this seminar is actually in the preparation of the Lisbon Early Career Workshop that will take place hopefully next year. And this is definitely a very promising project that the UTH and the AESOP Young Academics are joining efforts in materializing. And we are very thankful for what the team at the UTH and is doing in this regard. Welcome today, and we hope that we're going to spark a very interesting discussion. Other than the activity and other than this particular activity that the Young Academics is doing with the UTH, I would like please here to say a few words for whom who are not actually familiar with what is the Young Academics and what we actually do. So in a nutshell, the Young Academics Network is a group within the AESOP organization. It is a loosely structured group of young academics and practitioners who in a nutshell see a value in coming together and developing research and disseminating it within the field of academic planning. So the young academics, they gather members and friends from all over the world, and mainly concentrated in Europe, nevertheless spread all over the world. And we operate through several mediums, through website, Facebook, newsletters, and blog. So if you're not familiar with what we do, I would like to take this opportunity to say in very few words how you can actually interact with the young academics and how you can actually take part of this community. So first, by joining our website, I will add the link at the end about the Young Academics website, where you can be an active member. By registering, you will receive our newsletter, and you will be kept posted of our online activities and the main highlights of the month, and to track also other members' profile and getting in touch, especially in this virtual world, to get in touch with other members working in the planning field. You can also follow us on Facebook, on our social media platforms, Twitter. You can also write a blog and share it with us, as we have also a blog. And you can actually take part in the several events that we organize, be it the Young Academics Conference. We have our own conference other than the AESOP conference, and we have recently launched a series of webinars that actually tackles very interesting discussion that might be of an interest for you. We have the Best Paper Prize, several social events, expert clinics, and so many other opportunities of co-sharing session within the AESOP community. We have our own roundtable. So as you can see, there's so many opportunities, endless opportunities to take part in the Young Academics. So I genuinely hope that you will be able to use our platform, especially that this community building that the Young Academics is trying to do is essential nowadays, especially in this virtual world. And I genuinely hope that we will be able to see you live at some point whenever the situation allows. And other than that, please feel free to ask all the questions and the feedback, as I will be writing our email in our chat. And thank you so much. And hopefully we're going to have an amazing discussion today. Thanks.
Thank you, Rozana. So, well, just very short words. So the first keynote will be given by Gareth Militon, sociologist, based at the University of York, and he's been working on many different topics. Urban Criminology is his recent book with Roland Atkinson, but also, and that's one of the reasons why we invited, he's been very interested in the intersection between fictional representation and the city, particularly cinema. And that's why we asked him to help us think about thinking urban futures amid the pandemic. And he will be moderated by Olivia Bina, who's a senior research fellow at the Institute of Social Sciences at the University of Lisbon. And like I said, one of the two conveners, together with Roberto Falanga of the Urban Transitions Hub. After that, we're going to have a short break. And the second short keynote will be by Ella Babalik Sutcliffe. She's based at the Middle East Technical University of Ankara and has had very long experience in working, collaborating with ISOP, the Association of European Schools of Planning, where she has been part of the executive committee, etc. And she has been a big support to the activities on the ISOP Young Academics. And that's also one of the reasons why, apart from her expertise in transportation, in urban rail systems, also climate change action plans, we asked to help us think on researching, slightly different from the first keynote, on researching urban futures in this context. And Ella will be moderated by Andrea Pavoni. Andrea is a research fellow at Dinâmia'CET, a Center for Territorial Studies of the University Institute of Lisbon, and another member of the Urban Transitions Hub. With that being said, I will not take any more time. I will give the floor to to Olivia and Gareth for the first session.
Okay, thank you so much, Simone. And it's really lovely to see 39 souls gathered around around this platform. And really thanks, Simone, for organizing everything, for inviting all of us to be here today. And I'd like to then invite Gareth to give us his first keynote provocation, and then let's see if I'll stop you if you go beyond 30 minutes, but I think we can be flexible up to half an hour. Okay, so
sure.
Unless you want me to flash you at 5 to 30.
I'll be okay. I'll definitely come in under 30 minutes, I think.
That's great.
So what I'll try and do now is I'll try and share my screen. So okay.
Pois.
Okay. Good. Yeah. Okay. So thank you everyone for tuning in to listen, and thank you to Simone for inviting me to speak. It's a great honor, and I really wish I could be in Lisbon right now. So this title, Thinking Urban Futures Amid a Pandemic, is not a talk that I ever really expected to give. Consequently, I've been a little nervous about how to approach it. One thing I did to try to get some clues as to how to handle this topic was to listen or watch a talk given by Edward Glaser, Harvard professor and author of Triumph of the City. His talk at the Centre for London was titled End of an Era, Cities After Coronavirus, ? Glaser still speaks of triumph, although he admits that cities will have to adapt. And he revisited some of the big ideas from his book, such as how cities make people smarter, happier, and wealthier. And they're good for GDP too. And as much as I appreciated the talk, it didn't really get me thinking in the way that I hoped. There were lots of graphs, facts, projections, lots of talk of challenges and potential upsides to the pandemic. But really, in thinking about cities, I prefer texture. I like to know more about what is at stake. I also remain highly skeptical of the thrust of Glaser's book, that cities can somehow combine skyscrapers, tech villages, and financial centres with affordability, creativity, and community. Also, in preparing this talk, I had the misfortune of hearing Boris Johnson's super optimistic talk about post-COVID reconstruction in the UK. Always a fan of the three-word slogan, he calls this project Build Back Better. Now, this strikes me as one of Boris Johnson's dumbest slogans, especially the way it envisages COVID as an enemy that we are at war with, and that we can spite this enemy, show it who is boss, by the simple response of building back. And something last week reminded me of what Build Back Better will probably mean or entail in practice. In Brixton, London, a new 20-storey luxury tower was given planning permission, despite over 700 objections from the local community and reservations from the local Labour MP, who stated that nobody wants this building, that there is nothing special about its design, that it is indistinguishable from many other tall buildings across London. This, I presume, is what Build Back Better will come to mean. Building the same as pre-COVID, but slightly higher and in greater quantity. Identikit investment vehicles that damage communities, threaten local businesses, and displace residents. But we will do it anyway, even if this is a future that nobody wants, just to prove that there is a future after COVID, to show that the enemy has been defeated. My worry, therefore, is that the post-COVID city will be a grotesque, distorted mirror reflection of the pre-COVID city. So my approach to thinking about urban futures today is quite different. I've chosen to talk about three sources that have made me think about the city during this year, the year of the pandemic. These sources, a book, a film, and a CD, each in their own way make the city legible, revealing the metropolis as the site of the phantasmagoric and the mythic. They also, if we let them, prompt us to think about the future of cities. So let me begin with my first source. Erwin Gutwin's 1962 book, The Twilight of Cities. Gutkind was an architect, a planner and a scholar, an associate of the modernist Bauhaus School and a faculty member of the University of Pennsylvania. I recently borrowed this book from my university library because it was cited by Henri Lefebvre in his book Metaphilosophy. I was curious about it. Lefebvre cites Gutkind in a passage about how the city grows, it also shatters. But whereas Lefebvre is positive about the urban revolution that accompanies this expansion, Gutkind is very pessimistic, hence the title of the book, The Twilight of Cities. So what does the book say? Well, it's a response to a crisis that Gutkind himself appears to have willed into existence, mainly so that he can take control of it. After an historical examination of ancient, medieval and Renaissance cities, he arrives at the modern city and decides that in comparison, he despises everything about it. Its confused centres, its messiness, its sprawl and its lack of order. We need to abandon the millennia-old concept of the city, he argues, and the cult of the street to embrace a process of decentralisation and dispersal. The city has become a burden that we must face up to, he argues. And so, despite the millions of people who no doubt enjoyed living in their city in 1962, according to Gutkind, it was time to rip the whole thing apart and start again. Gutkind's plan is to replace inner city dwellings with the same number of dwellings, but in a more dispersed fashion. Central cities should be turned over to green space, retaining only a limited amount of desk space. New communities would form, he argued, in these smaller, more meaningful units, what he called ideal regions of the future. This program can become a reality, Gutkind writes, if we devote our whole personality to it, to the task. He then quotes Boris Pasternak, "Never for a single moment betray your credo." 2 points. The first is that Gutkind was profoundly wrong. What actually happened was that people returned. They came back to the city. They didn't share his abject response. Indeed, it was only 2 years later, in 1964, that Ruth Glass first coined the term gentrification. The second point is that while thankfully Gutkind's plan was never enacted, it would have caused more devastation to lives and to cities than a war, his nihilistic form of modernism has still left deep marks on our lives. And here I channel Marshall Berman's comments on Le Corbusier, that the tragic irony of modernist urbanism is that its triumph has helped to destroy the very urban life it hoped to set free. And of course, modernism itself was the umbrella term given to the multiple shifts in urban design following the Spanish flu of 1918. The public health agenda played no small part in modern planning. So the danger, as I see it, is that we run the risk of being seduced by the anti-urban measures installed in the COVID era to protect us. The lockdowns, the social distancing, the prohibition of social gatherings, working from home, protest, the closing of bars, restaurants, nightclubs, music venues, schools, universities, libraries, and archives. Indeed, it's often the left pushing for these closures against the libertarian populist right. It's a sensitive issue, but in thinking about the future of cities and urban environments, the left needs to be on the right side, the urban side of the debate. And let's not inadvertently endorse or blow air into the media-generated wealthy are fleeing the suburbs narrative. And now I want to turn to my second source, a film that I watched in the last couple of days before lockdown started here in the UK back in March. The film is Pawlikowski's My Summer of Love, released in 2004. And this was the only Pawlikowski film that I hadn't seen at the time. And I watched it because I was planning to write an article titled Pawlikowski's Cities. I haven't yet written this article, by the way. The film is set over the course of a long, hot summer in a small industrial town in West Yorkshire, England. It focuses on two late teenage girls. There is working class Mona, who lives with her recovering alcoholic brother Phil in the empty rundown pub that he used to manage. Phil is now a born-again Christian. and leads a prayer group in the town. Then there is the middle class and pretentious Edith Piaf devotee Tamsin, who is at home for the summer from boarding school and staying at her parents' house. They're rarely at home. A huge overgrown bohemian mansion on the edge of town. The girls become friends and more over the course of the summer. There are 2 points I want to make about my summer of love. The first is that it's a reminder of the kind of summer most of us have not had the freedom to enjoy this year. The atmosphere for many of Mona and Tamsin's scenes is languid and carefree. They overcome their loneliness and boredom together. They drink lots of wine, take magic mushrooms, they swim in the river, they sleep outside, they enjoy freedoms that seem very distant right now. So the film is a warm, tantalizing reminder of what could await us as we emerge from this crisis, or at least for young people. I don't necessarily include myself in that. My second point focuses on Mona's brother, Phil. Now, he's become a kind of charismatic preacher. He's overwhelmed with the energy of his own recovery, and he now wants to convert others. Phil is another man with a dangerous plan. He has stared into the abyss too long, one senses. One of his obsessions is to build a large cross and position this on a hill overlooking the town. In effect, he constructs this small Yorkshire town's very own Cristo Rei to ward against godlessness and to remind the town, not least his sister, of their sins. There is evil in this valley, he cries, but God is more powerful than the devil. Phil's positivity is like a mania. He has too strong a sense of his redemption, too strong a sense of the guilt of others. Now, just for fun, Tamsin decides to flirt with Phil, Mona's brother. One morning, Tamsin attempts to seduce Phil, only to rebuff him as he moves to kiss her, revealing him for the man that he still is, despite the piety. At this point, the whole edifice falls apart and Phil turns violent, taking out all his frustrations on Mona, who he locks in her room. So the film teaches us about an overly optimistic or positive attitude towards recovery and rebuilding, about how positivity can easily lead to a war against sinners, non-believers or dissenters, tipping into authoritarianism and or moral fundamentalism. For us, thinking about the post-COVID recovery, the same lessons apply. Authoritarianism, iconoclasm, and nationalism, you don't need me to tell you, are already present dangers. Okay, let me turn to my third and final source, a CD. Remember those? That I bought and listened to in my car a lot over the summer. The CD is a compilation of mixes by the Brooklyn-born producer and DJ Larry Levan, who died in 1992. I was drawn to this because I'm a big fan of house music, and Levan, along with his friend Frankie Knuckles, are considered pioneers of house music. Levan befriended Knuckles as teenagers, both enthralled by Manhattan's ball culture scene, a meeting point for many gay black men at the time. The CD also relates closely to a book that I admire, Tim Lawrence's Life and Death on the New York Dance Floor. Larry Levan is a central character in the book, which tells the story of New York nightlife in the early 1980s, an experimental period at the end of the disco era. One of the primal sites of the book is the Paradise Garage, the club in Soho where Levan was a DJ. Now, early 1980s Manhattan has a special place in the heart of many urbanists, especially those economists who dream of being able to turn back the clock to repeat the magic formula of culture-led regeneration, which is now an organizing myth of the city, circulating way beyond New York itself. It's a future that city managers want to relive again and again. But yes, this period does capture the city before gentrification, when Manhattan was still real. Sharon Zukin's work on authenticity deals brilliantly with these themes. David Harvey also writes about this period in New York history in his book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism. But my focus is not on how culture can spark economic recovery, but on how responses to hard times are not always reactionary. It goes without saying that New York was a very tough city during this period. Yet Louvain and others do not simply reflect this reality. They gave a style to life, to use Nietzsche's phrase. Their response to hardship and discrimination was active, whether it constituted dancing, DJing, mixing, listening, developing bespoke hi-fi technology, and so forth. Louvain and others became more than simply the bare facts of their existence. Louvain himself was known for his instinctive ability to blend sounds: disco, rock, electro, gospel, funk, and soul. Louvain had no big plan. He was all about the mix, an open-minded DJ with a specific ear for the unknown, for the untried. And yet, as Lawrence explains in his book, the downtown scene of this period was not concerned with idolatry. Rather, it was the kids, some who could barely scrape together the price of admission, who were really the heart and soul of the Paradise Garage. Louvain played music that lifted these dancers. In turn, they urged and inspired him to raise them higher, to play the music that would move their bodies and minds in new ways. Compared to other DJs, no one else quite had this reach. As Lawrence puts it, when Louvain played, it felt like the whole city was listening. What I'm going to try and do now is play a 1-minute clip from a documentary that is on YouTube. I'll try and do this. It might work, it might not. Here we go. Okay, I'm not sure that's going to work. Okay, I'll leave that for now, it's fine. No, hang on. Okay. I will leave that. So, but however, as is hinted by the title of Lawrence's book, Tragedy Was to Follow. By 1983, AIDS gripped the scene. As Lawrence explains, people started to get sick at an alarming rate, and people eventually stopped going to the Paradise Garage because it was too painful to go to a place with so many memories of the fun times they had enjoyed with their friends and lovers. A feeling of dread was now in every embrace. But gentrification also played a part in ending the scene, causing Lawrence to ask, were the participants in the Manhattan party scene of the early 1980s somehow responsible for its demise? This pressure to accept one's guilt for gentrification is a curious feature of some of the facets of the urban academic left, and believe it or not, has led to a series of confessional journal articles. I'm reminded here of Deleuze's comments on Nietzsche's notion of bad conscience which cries, it's my fault, until the whole world takes up this dreary refrain, until everything active in life develops this same feeling of guilt. Lauren eventually, thankfully, arrives at a different lesson that we can learn from. He writes, clearly the re-democratizing of New York remains daunting, yet the gathering desire to listen to music, dance and engage creatively with a level of public freedom that was once taken for granted is visceral. Feeding the appetite for change, the downtown era and its scarcely believable level of activity attest to that. Given the right conditions, a different kind of city can exist. And this passage is remarkably apt. And yes, we can think urban futures, but also what do our bodies need? This is the Paradise Garage stage. It's been demolished, and the site itself is a kind of historic or heritage site, especially amongst the LGBTQ community. Okay, so how can we think about urban futures amid a pandemic? And my answer really, in short, is with skepticism. Beware of big plans, big projections, mega events, and mega structures. At all costs, dismiss the language of war. Be alert to old ideas regurgitated as new. Build back better, or the mythical return to 1980, the ground zero of culture-led regeneration. Be wary of the pessimists who see the post-COVID world as an opportunity to destroy everything we love about cities. They will, no doubt, also be happy to dial back on recent advances made in terms of minority rights, decolonisation and environmentalism. Be equally wary of those driven by excessive positivity, those who talk with a zeal about urban futures, who want us all to play a part, and when their plans inevitably fail, confess that they failed because we were too cynical and didn't believe in them enough. But none of this means we shouldn't anticipate progressive change. My modest suggestion is that we remain active and alert as researchers and activists. We need to practice and work at our craft every day. Our individual small projects started before the pandemic still matter. We need to keep checking in with and listening to our respondents, many of whom are the most marginalised residents of the city. As Ho and Madrell recently point out, there's a need for research on social groups that are experiencing the impacts of the pandemic acutely, especially those with multiple intersectional burdens. We should be tuned into this mix, this cacophony of voices, but also how individuals have been affected by the pandemic. What are their immediate needs? What changes would they like to see? What have been their sources of strength? What protection do they require, but also what freedoms are they being denied? And listening isn't passive, as Les Back reminds us in his important book, The Art of Listening. It also involves the active process of making sense, critique. To return once again to Glaser, where I began, well, it's clear to me there isn't any kind of triumph in prospect. There is no post-COVID future for cities that is free from the threat of war, poverty, discrimination, or disease. The present crisis only adds weight, in my view, to Walter Benjamin's far more inspiring understanding of modernity as a condition of permanent catastrophe. Okay, I'll finish there. Thank you for listening.
Yes, okay. Wow, thank you, Gareth. That was a run at high speed in multiple dimensions and disciplinary perspectives. Very impressive. I'm going to have to catch my own breath to follow the logics. But thank you so much, because it was, as you said at the beginning, you've really taken a different angle to this conversation, which has already entered this pattern of enormous amounts of data, more or less provisional, and references to models, ideas, and imaginaries that were already there before the pandemic, just to a large extent, and are now finally being reproposed as the new old, or yes. So thank you for really challenging, bringing us a very, very fresh view and a very fresh way of thinking about this. Now, I'm supposed to collect questions or interventions or reactions. You don't have to necessarily stick to the format of Q&A. If you're happy to add or ask for clarifications, we have an open floor, and really this is the purpose, that we want to give you the opportunity to have a conversation with some wonderful scholars, but I'm not seeing, let me check, sorry, I have to flick through my pages here. Ooh, everybody has muted themselves. I may start being concerned. Have you adopted the lockdown of your own microphones? No?
I can kick off if no one wants to start.
Please do. I mean, I can also, I wanted to just refer to something I heard. Simone, sorry, let me just then do this whilst our colleagues and students gather some courage. Yesterday, Gareth, I was trying to relate to your topic, and so I went to scanning for some interesting interventions, and I heard Edgar Peters from South Africa, from Cape Town,
Sure.
giving a very short talk about his take exactly on the same topic, but for the African continent, if one can do that. And interestingly, he did a sort of halfway house. I mean, he fell into the potentially the trap of the data. But one figure that he quoted is, of course, relevant, I think, also to our conversation. He sort of closed his very brief intervention where he highlighted essentially the issue of inequalities of jobs as two of the main areas of concern. And he did close by saying, we do need, well, I'm not sure he said to capture the opportunity, but he sort of went to, if this is to be something that actually bring desired change, then we are looking for new models that serve what he called the 68% of population living on 3% of the wealth. And he was quoting the World Economic Forum data, but Oxfam has offered similar data. So he was really focusing that on that problematic, and the jobs issue is of course something, and I wonder whether you haven't mentioned jobs specifically, and the sort of the economic, you have implicitly of course, but you've given a broader scale, and I wonder whether you had any specific additional comment that you could offer on this theme, which is going to hit us as rather badly, I suspect, as well in richer countries and contexts. And I know in the UK there is already a conversation about this somehow.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I wouldn't say that I have anything particularly kind of enlightening to add to any debates on this. I mean, I think we all know that, in many cities across the globe, unemployment is going to be a kind of one terrible effect from this period, and it kind of exacerbates some of the issues that we were facing before the pandemic about the need for the kind of jobs that offer people some security, actually, so that they can start thinking about the future a little bit more, and can regain a kind of sense of dignity, if you like, and perhaps even kind of craft, I don't know. But yeah, there is going to be, this is going to be a large part of the crisis, and I think this is one of the problems with kind of trying to predict futures, is because the kind of the future from this crisis is going to last a long time. In many senses, we were only kind of, I'm speaking from the UK here, but we only really, the full effect, if you like, of the austerity measures introduced in 2010 only really started to appear 2016 onwards, in a sense, So I think that, this period is going to really shape the future in lots of difficult ways, and creating enough jobs, as I said, sustainable jobs for people is going to be a huge issue. And I guess from that perspective of Edgar Peters talking about South Africa and so on, I mean, in African cities, people, in many African cities, people are very used to this kind of daily struggle for survival. And I think that's kind of continued through the pandemic, and it continues now as well. I mean, this is the, futures are, our sense of kind of future and temporality can be changed itself by this crisis. So what I mean is that, our kind of, the period in which we see ourselves as having to survive can become a lot shorter, and our vision of the future becomes much shorter as well. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, there is a real, the jobs crisis is going to be a big part of this, I'm sure. And it is going to affect our understanding of what the future actually is on an individual and a societal level.
Yes, thanks. I mean, that in itself is, of course, a potentially an enormously different and complicated theme, but it is certainly going to affect the texture of our cities. If what has happened 10 years ago, as you rightly invoke, my favorite crisis, the financial crisis of 2008, and the way we reacted to it, if we're going to do similar things, and quite frankly, what I see is very much in line with what happened in 2008 for different topic, but the ethos of the proposals is in no way different. And this time the texture of the urban scale will be affected, because mobility for work and all that will witness very significant changes. But anyway, we can get back to this if other students or other colleagues are interested in discussing this. But Simone, I cut you off, so I beg your pardon, and I give you the floor.
I'm just, since questions are starting to pop up, I will, we agreed that I would bring, the written questions there. I mean, so the first was by Gloria Lanci, and it's probably easier we read also for the discussion. And she asked, much has been said about the inequalities that this pandemic is revealing. How do you see the urban landscape post-pandemic? Do you think we can go back pre-1980s with emptied inner cities? And to that I would add, I was thinking about asking you, this very much links, that at the beginning of the pandemic, there has been much of this discussion, New York City, it's the big cities that help spread the pandemic. Then quantitative studies demonstrate that wasn't the case. There has not been a faster spread in dense cities. Actually, lately, there's been even the opposite. In the USA, I think now more bigger issues are in rural areas, but this has not been so much reported by media. So adding to this question by Gloria, whether there is a role, of course there is a role, but what do you think about the role of the media, of these ideas of the danger of the city in this and on what this may tell for the future?
Sorry, can you repeat that, the kind of the nub of the question again? I didn't quite catch the...
Gloria's question was, how do you see the urban landscape post-pandemic, and in particular, whether we can go back to those empty inner cities of pre-1980s? And I was adding the role of this media rhetoric on the danger of the city.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there is going to be a degree where I guess there is an emptying out of the kind of the central city, especially the kind of business district of the city. What this will mean is yet to be seen, really. I mean, one thing that has happened in the UK, which has been terrible, really, is old office blocks have been subdivided and subdivided and subdivided to provide accommodation, really, really small rooms for kind of families to live in. So redundant office blocks have become really, really low income housing, and it's not even really designed to be housing. This is a terrible thing. So I'd be very worried about kind of the emptying out and then the refilling of business districts with this kind of development. I mean, that is a potential, because the people who own these office blocks and so on, they're already talking about their perspective in the crisis, that they're going to lose all this rental income and so on, and of course they will do. And I guess they're not going to take it lying down. They're going to reinvent or repurpose these buildings. But I also think there is this optimism, and Glazer kind of in that talk that I mentioned, he sort of talked about, one of the upsides of the pandemic is that rents will come down. Young people, creatives again, will flood back into the city, and we'll go back to 1980 again. This is this kind of there's always like an upside to this, but it's only an upside because of what we know about the city of the past, and revisiting those old models and those old logics, and I don't know. I think that's kind of futile, really. I'm more worried about the first scenario that I spoke about kind of office blocks being repurposed as very low income housing. because that has happened. It's in the UK, you know.
Simone, do you continue to are you there? Oh,
I
yeah.
can,
So,
yeah.
Okay.
If you want me to read the other questions, yes. So next online, Hannah Saldert, and she links to sustainable planning. The idea that we are looking for solutions for complex, wicked problems and good examples. And so on are often lifted or given. At the same time, we should be critical in our research. This is probably a big question. And how can we balance the critical perspective while finding solutions?
Yeah, I don't know if I can add much to that. So I mean, it's a really, really good question and an important question that you know, cannot be dismissed. Even if, you know, like myself, you know, some urban scholars have a kind of preference for that kind of, you know, richness, the kind of textual approach to understanding the city. We do still need solutions. There are still wicked problems, and I would imagine they're only going to get kind of more wicked as we move forward. I think really in these discussions, though, you know, and this is what I was trying to hint at towards the end of my talk, is that we have to not be reactionary in a sense, you know, in all the different ways that you can be reactionary, that really in these discussions it is time to listen to lots of people, you know, lots of individuals, lots of groups, and to try and understand, like, you know, like they may already have some solutions to some of these problems, you know, the supposedly brainy people can't figure out solutions to. They may have some of these solutions. And that's not kind of really to romanticize or so on, but I think there has to be a willingness, you know, to not necessarily look for leaders in this situation, but to really understand, like, you know, what people have been going through, how they've dealt with so many of the terrible effects of the pandemic, and also the lockdown that have approached it. You know, what are people actually doing? Because people are doing things. They're always doing things, but you just have to try and notice what it is that they're doing. One of the reasons, it's funny because I don't know if it's the case for everybody listening, but kind of because we haven't been able to travel and kind of we've all been focused so much on our own national responses to the pandemic, you know, I've paid a lot more attention to what's going on in the UK probably than I usually do. But like one of the problems has been with the UK's response is that it's all been kind of top down. Yeah. So the people trying to solve the big problems of the pandemic have been about three or four people have been making the decisions, you know, all white men, you know, they're the ones supposedly with the brains trying to make all these decisions. And there's all these networks, you know, to do with health, to do with kind of, you know, communication and so on, all these communities that could have been utilized and already have this knowledge, already have lots of solutions. And they just have been ignored because the government wants to kind of control everything. You know, they've seen it as an opportunity to control. And I think that's what we could do with moving away from. If there's one thing I would like to see happen, it's that really, you know, as well as a massive redistribution of wealth, of course. That's another matter. Yeah. But it's a good question. That's not really an answer, but I think, you know, that's what I was getting at towards the end of my talk, that really we should start listening and watching and learning, you know, what is actually going on in many places.
Since this links with the last question that was put, where we'll jump it before it's by the question by Lizzie Privitera, and you know, so we've seen, especially in some areas during the first phases of the lockdown, civil society organizing itself, providing a sort of emergency community welfare to all those affected by the lockdown on an economic, but without also social point of view. And so the question, what do you think of these bottom-up solidarity practices and how they can be linked and be made to contribute to future urban policies?
I mean, that's the kind of, the corollary to what I was talking about, really. And I guess that it needs to become a movement that lasts. I think it needs to become a movement that I mean, it's kind of developed out of necessity, but it needs to kind of become to assume some kind of permanence, as a movement, whether it's allied to a kind of, a political party or some kind of movement. I think there's always the danger that these things get co-opted, of course, by political parties, by the state, and so on. But I think importantly, what they need to do is to gain some kind of permanence, and to eventually become kind of so powerful that they can no longer be ignored. I think that's the crucial thing. I think that could happen if you have governments at this moment, and government's very important at this moment, of course. If governments are willing to listen, they're willing to include a kind of much broader kind of body politic, really.
Okay, I've been invited to take over the reading of the question, Gareth. So I'll read on to the next one, but just to chip in on that, because it's somewhat close to my own interest in such something more prosaic, which is interdisciplinarity. And I noted with a certain anxiety the lack of involvement, even in terms of at the expert level, of different voices and different disciplines, even just in the reaction of that centralization, that command and control, which reappeared with a vengeance with this crisis. And yet we haven't even been able to get psychologists on the ground at the same time and so that doesn't bode well, but doesn't bode well to go all the way to where you would like to see us getting to, which is involving, listening, and providing, affording the time for that communication and that exchange to take place in a way that is generative or something different and new. So, but sorry, I didn't want to be.
No, that's very important. If I could just come in there again, I think you see in these discussions that they are really quite limited. And in the UK, we have something called the SAGE committee, which is the kind of the official body of experts that drive or supposedly produce the science that guides the government. But there was also an alternative committee, which is called the Independent SAGE Group, and they run their discussions kind of online. And but even within those, because you can watch the discussions, when the socialist enters into the debate, the scientists from certain disciplines will say, okay, enough. We can deal with issues of race later. They're important, but we will deal with those later. But for now, we must use data. And that's how it seems to work, even in the kind of oppositional, committees of experts. So what you're saying is absolutely, and again, I think also that if you can establish these kind of these groups, even at a local level, the fact is that they will still be relevant as we emerge from the worst parts of this crisis, and the crisis will continue, as we've already discussed, through things like unemployment, poverty, and so on. These things are going to be serious problems that we need the involvement of interdisciplinary experts and communities as well. These need to become permanent. They need to become some kind of a movement, or aligned to some kind of movement or party.
Yes. Okay, let me give voice to one or more of our questions online. So this is from Rachel Shikluna. As a sociologist, researching the urban fabric of cities with historical specificity, how can our methodologies as social scientists respond creatively to address larger issues around the urban landscape, policy, homes, and so on? And how can governments make use of our data in a rapid manner? So a little bit counter to what we've just said.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the second part of the question, we would all love governments to take social science more seriously, and especially kind of sociology. I mean, some social sciences, both like economics and sometimes psychologists, yeah, these get listened to, but sociologists, not so much. I would love that to change. That would be great. I mean, in terms of methodologies, though, that's a really interesting question. And again, you know, we have some pretty good techniques at our disposal. You know, as social scientists, and you know, I'm a qualitative social scientist predominantly. I mean, one of the things, obviously, that we do is we talk to people, which is really important. We do listen. You know, we are quite well attuned at listening, and I think that's really important. But we also have, you know, other kind of methodologies, and you know, some of my PhD students, you know, do some great things with kind of, you know, walking interviews and so on. You know, where the narrative of the respondent is linked to place, you know, an urban neighborhood. And so we gain a kind of richer sense of one's position in a kind of social context. But we also have, I also have students who are doing kind of, and I'm sure many people listening here are doing the same things, which is why all our projects are important, is kind of collaborative research, whereby actually we work at problem solving with the people, you know, we are working with. They're not simply respondents, they're kind of co-producers of knowledge, co-producers of solutions to problems. And you know, social science is really good at this stuff, you know, social science maybe doesn't speak loud enough about these kind of things that it does do. You know, it probably is well placed to understand the kind of innovation that is already going on, you know, amongst different communities. So I think, I don't think social science is in a bad place in terms of the techniques that we have to understand social reality. We're in a bad place in getting people to listen to them, but I don't think that's always been the case. I think that we have some good techniques, and we should continue to use them and adapt them to the changing context.
Thank you, Gareth. I mean, the dread of the big data gathering process, which of course started well before this latest crisis, and the way it's becoming used in many parts of the world, not necessarily yet in the UK, but I'm thinking of other countries that have chosen with abandon to use apps and tracking devices that will deliver other results. And so again, we have the means becoming an end in itself, and of course it's very hard for our methodologies, which are so much more complex, and it's always a matter also of time, I find.
Yeah, sure.
Because everything I mean, I was already tired with the urgencies of the last 3 decades without having to be put in a situation where the urgency is now 10 times more urgent than anything else. And so you are almost cornered before you even try to offer an approach, because it just seems so out of sync with the speed with which everything seems to move. And
I mean, to think that we were talking about kind of the slow university and all these kind of things before.
Yeah.
I think that's gone out the window now. You know, it's
Yes. Oh God. Right. Let me give voice to. Have we read Lizzie Pivitera? No. Thank you very much for your talk. I also would like to.
Yes, we did.
Sorry, that was the one that you jumped. Yes, sorry, because of course Simone has to be out of sync with the order. I am a very right. So Luisa Rossini.
Yes, Simone invited me to ask it myself.
Oh,
right.
thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, much better.
So,
thank you.
yes, I was attending recently a conference about municipalizing Europe, and I was wondering, because it was discussed on the centrality of giving to cities an actual opportunity to answer the problematics that are generated into cities by the pandemic. There are many. So basically, what I was wondering, I mean, all the discussion was based basically on refunding cities and on a further decentralization of power. So I was now thinking that these post-pandemic cities will actually take this path and so become even more central than before, or you think the opposite? I mean, because from our discussion, it was looking like maybe cities won't be anymore a point of reference, but from what I'm seeing, it could be even the opposite way.
Yeah, thank you. That's a brilliant question. I think that is a kind of process that's going to be very interesting to watch and see how it plays out. Certainly in the UK, power's been very centralized, but there's been a big struggle from city mayors to kind of to be heard. So we've had a kind of, you know, there was a big standoff between central government in London and the cities of Manchester and Liverpool, because they were not being treated the same. They were not being, the residents of those cities in the north were not receiving the same amount of financial assistance as those in London or in the south. So this issue, you know, it has been this year of real significance. But this is at this stage of the pandemic. But as you say, as we don't necessarily know how things are going to, our city's going to remain as important as they are. Is this only going to further kind of increase that kind of expansion of cities to a more kind of generalized urbanization, where cities are not as important as municipal units? And that is very interesting. I mean, I don't know. What do you think will happen? How do you think this will play out? Have you got any thoughts on it yourself?
Well, I think it's pretty complex, as you mentioned. So on one side, people looks like running away from cities because being afraid of being locked in their houses and the concentration on the pandemic in the cities, etc. But on the other side, they are really now claiming for housing and other basic rights that can be in a way more represented into cities, also because of aggregation of the demand. So what I see is basically that this crisis is just making more clear that there are basic needs that are central problems to be managed, and I think that in this moment cities have the urgency to be able to give this answer, because they are like in the they are now asked to do it. So I don't really have an idea on how to answer it. I thought that can be an interesting point to renew our way to see what does it mean as cities, not just providing services for big investors, but it's also should provide participated solution for its own citizens. So maybe it could produce, this situation could produce this kind of shift. That's what I hope, at least.
Yeah, that would be a good outcome, I think. I mean, I guess thinking more about it, I think that, and I suppose I hinted at this in my presentation, that I think that media narrative about people leaving the city, especially the wealthy, I think we've got to be careful about not kind of giving that too much credence, too much life. You know, I don't know if that will happen in big numbers. I don't think it's an option for lots of people to leave the city because of their work, because of their livelihoods, their social ties, family, and so on. I I don't necessarily think that after this pandemic, people will seek more isolation rather than less. You know, I think we have to be careful with that. I mean, the media, I mean, this is talking about the kind of the speed of responses again, which you spoke to, which is very important. You know, the media kind of like latch onto these things as if they are a phenomenon that is kind of already fully formed, you know, that people are leaving the cities in their droves. And they were saying this back in April when you couldn't even leave your house, let alone, you know. So maybe like a few very wealthy people were moving to second or third homes where they could. But for most people, I don't think this is an option. So I think we have to be wary of kind of, social scientists always have to, don't we? Always have to be wary of following a media-led agenda. Or at least, you know, when we do enter it, we kind of are pretty skeptical about what it is that they're saying. But anyway, it's a great question, and I think that will be very interesting to watch how it plays out. So, I
would, if I may, I would also say, I mean, Luisa, I think that it depends also, linking back to the issue of jobs. It's what are we talking about? I mean, it's really a minority of wealthy on the one hand, or not a minority, but still only a section of society that can afford to telework. And so there will be always people who cannot afford this solution of escaping the city.
But I think that sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No.
And because I'm observing the situation, for example, here in Barcelona, where I am right now, and it's slightly different because not everybody could have a remote work. So many people have actually lost their job, and they're actually not finding any kind of job in the city anymore. So they are trying to find another solution, moving abroad. And that means sometimes like moving to the countryside and trying to find another kind of solution that the city is not providing anymore. So in these terms, I don't see that clear the division between rich and poor people in terms of the opportunity to leave the city or the will to leave the city. So sometimes people is forced because the city is too expensive and is not anymore offering job opportunities. That was the only thing that was making it, let's say, affordable. So without the job, it's not affordable at all, and there is no way to stay in a way.
Yeah. That's an interesting observation. Yeah.
Okay. Now, is there any other? Andrea. Yes, please. I mean,
Yeah. Thank Gareth. Actually, it was supposed to be a question, but it's kind of, I tried to think about a way to put it as a question, but I didn't find a way. So I will like add a convoluted comment to your presentation, which I like very much. And I want a bit to come back to, I mean, the key of your presentation. On the one hand, the imagination of the future, and on the other, the kind of the affective potential of the experience of the city, and the way in which is being to some extent overlooked in two ways. On the one hand, in a very physical sense, of course, as we know, with the measures, and on the other, in the way in which we try to think a way out, either in a smart city technocratic thinking, or in the left thinking about rightly thinking about structural change in order to address inequalities, but we're not thinking about the experience in itself and what makes city, you know, like the sharing of experience. And this reminded me this short passage by a short text by Benjamin about the structure, the poverty of experience, I think it's called, and it's about and he talks about the people coming back from the First World War and the fact that they were unable to tell their story. They were unable to share their experience with the people that stay because their experience was so different. They didn't have shared coordinates anymore, which is something that also reminded me this beautiful scene in the Deer Hunter when there is the wedding and there is Robert De Niro and Christopher Walken and John Savage, which are drunk and happy, and then there is this Green Beret which is drinking, and they go there to him, no, and talk to him and say, tell us, how is it? And he just reply, fuck it, and he say like 3-4 times fuck it, like completely unable to share their experience, no? And what is interesting in the situation now is that actually, as we know, even before the pandemic, we have more and more capacity to share experience, or at least we think. But of course, this sharing of experience is less and less tied to a kind of bodily sharing, a kind of contingent sharing, is much more mediated. And of course, I mean, thousands of words has been spent in this mediation and the effects, etc., etc. But of course, all these words gain much more interest now that actually the prophecies, if you want to say, are happening. You know? So actually, the question is, why is that the left has lost sight, lost touch with this dimension? I mean, in the 60s, 70s, this was all about what the left was doing, no? Even in a more like voluntaristic, spontaneistic way, hippie generation, etc., rediscovering the body, rediscovering community, rediscovering sharing, dancing, whatever, the stuff you were talking about as well, even in the 80s. Now we see, especially in the reaction to the pandemic, the very crazy and dystopian dimension in which the left is becoming more and more the moralizing part, moralizing people. And then there is the populistic right that is reclaiming the right to be in the street. Of course, the populistic right is doing it in a kind of distorted way, but you know, this is very dystopian and crazy. So I want just to see what you have to say about this.
Yeah, thanks. That's great. Yeah, yeah. That kind of, I think you captured better, like some of the things that I was talking about. Really, I think, yeah, the left has kind of, to an extent, kind of like been driven down this like rabbit hole, if you like, of wanting. Obviously wanting to protect people, sure, and afford workers protections and all that kind of good stuff that you expect the left to do, really. But at the same time, they have almost unwittingly kind of ended up endorsing, as you say, the kind of the lockdown. They've taken the kind of moralistic position, like more than the right have. It's problematic, and as you say, that's kind of something that the left has left behind. I mean, there's so much in that. I mean, obviously in terms of political parties and so on, it's maybe slightly differently, but the left more generally, you know, the move away from a kind of, you know, a humanist Marxist position towards different kinds of Marxist positions, or away from kind of Marxism altogether. That takes away a lot of the focus on kind of activity, you know, sensuous experience and so on. And you know, in a way, there is something that's lost, I think, from that move. And not everybody will agree with me, I know, but you know, the writers that kind of inspire me generally do focus on that side of things, which is why I've emphasized it in my talk. Maybe there's an opportunity for those kind of voices to be heard again. I don't know, as people kind of feel the strain on their bodies, not just on their minds, of lockdown, all these restrictions. Maybe there will be a kind of rediscovery of some of those themes that you think have been lost. I don't know. What I mean, what do you think? What do you think?
No, I mean, of course, yeah. I mean, the question that it's very. I mean, it's very confused, of course, because of course it's very hard to know where to stand in this situation, and you can blame, or rather, you can realize what the left is doing. You cannot really blame it, apart from the fact that talking about the left is a bit, you know, we use it as a shortcut, of course.
Yeah.
But of course, it's very complex, and it's true that there is this connection between libertarianism on the one hand, moralization on the other. But of course, I mean, I think definitely that the left should find a way, to replug into this dimension, because I mean, what is about to come back to one other quote, or one other author that you quote, which is Nietzsche, no? And what has been happening during the pandemic has been, to some extent, a kind of again, pretty dystopian freezing of our values. Now, what is essential, which we found out is just working until dying, basically, and nothing more. And what is not essential, which we realize is dancing, but also going to museum or concerts, etc. And to some extent, we've seen this in a very, sometimes this argument is made simplistically, but sometimes it's really crazy. I mean, what in Italy, the fact that they close museum is unbelievable. I mean, museums are super safe. You can have a limited amount of visitors. It's madness to close museum, for instance. So, but of course you don't close like other. So this idea of a freezing of values, no, what is essential, what is not essential, and of course, as we know, skewed towards a very precise socio-economical order of society. And so the point is, if the left doesn't, look at this situation, trying to really challenge, transvaluate these values in this condition, trying to re-talk about what are our values as society and what is actually essential and what is not. I mean, this is a lost opportunity. I'm not saying that nobody's doing it, of course, but I think that the stress is much more on other dimension, and one of these is moralization, which is also a reaction now, because a lot of the left is trying to resist to the populist call, etc., etc. But I think it will be a lost opportunity, because I think probably the worst scenario of post-COVID is that we wake up in post-COVID and nothing has changed at all, nothing. So, I mean, and in terms of values, I think, and the question of values is definitely a question of the left, like challenging the values, not accepting blindly the values and then moralizing over values. And, center left in Europe is doing exactly this now, like pure moralization. The right is doing its job, like trying to challenge values, but in a very egoistic way. And the third option is to try to challenge this value and reconnect them in a way which is not individualistic, it's social, etc., etc. It's very, it's very easy to say it like this, But
no, I agree with what you say, and that is that position, that kind of third position that you identify is not really being filled at the moment. And so it seems like for people on the left, there are not many ways that you can go, and people are, as I said, forced into kind of arguing for things that under any other circumstances they would reject, or at least you would hope that they would. So anyway, yeah, that's great. Yeah.
Okay, Gareth, I have another question for you via Simone. Can I ask Simone to unmute himself?
Hi again.
Thanks.
Are you able to hear me? I think a lot of actually strands of my question were already answered, but basically it was boiling down to the idea that we are in a obviously pandemic, a very human tragedy, but actually from my experience, this is probably the time that data and numbers have been more and more kind of becoming prominent, and everybody's actually talking about them a lot. Yeah. So it's really interesting to me to understand, to kind of think about what's that failure of social science to actually communicate that human experience. Now, I know that's kind of linking to your talk, because obviously you were drawing connections between a lot of different strands of actually people experiencing the city. And in the past 2 days, I've been in a conference, which this year is taken virtually, the Smart City sort of annual conference organized by the municipality of Barcelona. And actually the mood there is obviously recognizing that, but I think very effectively assimilating it and then strengthening the case for actually data-driven decisions. So I think there is a big failure of actually communicating the human experience in the city. And I think, we've already kind of discussed that, but the question probably is maybe what next? How do we actually crawl a space, or try to do the other way around, actually trying to simulate data and then put it through the filter of human experience rather than the other way around? Because I think in that case, my future view is not very optimistic about how decisions will be made in the urban realm in the future. I think more and more it would be driven by numbers rather than by actual experience. So yeah. I don't know if that makes sense. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, what's the so was your suggestion that social science needs to think about how the numbers get kind of filtered through, into how the data gets filtered through into human experience? And I
think so, because at the moment, I mean, a lot of the conversations at the moment in the area that I'm working in are obviously, you know, driven by the pandemic, but the actual tragedy of people suffering, you know, from the pandemic, of changing the experience of the city, of maybe having long-term conditions, that sort of stuff, is just completely glossed over. And it's the economic, the maybe transport, the numberized side of the city that is becoming more and more prominent.
Yeah, that's definitely the case, isn't it? I think it is about the speed of data as well, isn't it? You know, and the different kinds of data. You know, we have, you know, so much data that is collected and is available instantaneously for those people who have access to it. The rest of us are just kind of at the mercy of the kind of algorithms and all this kind of stuff, you know. But it takes longer, doesn't it, to listen to people, to collate and put together and make sense of their experiences. And sometimes those things don't appear until 2-3 years after the event, because they just take so long. Journalists can maybe do it quicker than social scientists, but again, they've got different agendas, and you know, we've spoken a bit about that already. I mean, yeah, like, you know, I get where you're coming from, because on one hand, as I've said before, I'm quite optimistic about some of the techniques qualitative social scientists have to make sense of the world, to understand how other people are making sense of the world, coming up with solutions, so on and so forth. But then, you know, as you say, you know, our disciplinary crisis in a way is the fact that these other forms of data become so much more easily available and usable, and they appear to kind of tell us so much more as well. So many of the things that we think that we need to know. Yeah, so you're pessimistic. I think I'm
realistic, not pessimistic
as well, actually. What can we do? What do you think we can do?
No, I mean, from my point of view, I don't think it's pessimism. I think it's just realism. You know, just kind of sitting on some local policy forums as well. I think that quantitative data is much easier digested by policymakers than actual, you know, qualitative or human experience, unless he actually, you know, as you say, it's a journalist or something's happened that is in the public realm. And I think maybe it's about the output. I don't know. Sometimes when I'm looking or writing at some of my conclusions, and I think maybe that should be in a different output that could actually be taken, you know, kind of work with that. I don't know. You know, that's why I asked the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think also what you know, what we have to do is to ask questions about those data sets, what that data is doing, who's controlling. We need to ask all of those questions as well, because of the work that they're doing. You know, we have to have that critical and develop that critical perspective on those forms of data and how they're being used. Certainly, that's an important agenda, I think, going forward.
Okay. I'm going to thanks, Gareth, for answering all these questions. They came in one after the other. So I think I hope that the organizers are all satisfied with the first leg of this afternoon. And I'm going to give back the word to Simone, who wanted to indeed thank all the organizers and introduce the short break before we move on to the next speaker. Yeah,
sorry,
sure.
Can I just say thanks again for inviting me? I'm going to stick around, obviously, but thanks again for inviting me, and thanks for the discussion, for all the questions. And yeah, this has been the best thing I've done since lockdown. So I've really enjoyed it. It's been great.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Simone.
That's great to hear, Gareth, and you know, and thank you, Olivia, for great moderation. And yeah, it was a very fun conversation. I hope it's going to be as fun in the next session after the short break. Before, my sincere apologies, I've forgotten to mention the other three organizers of this event of the workshop to be, that are Mariana from the Institute of Social Sciences of the University of Lisbon, Carolina Henriques and Joana Catela from Dinâmia'CET, the University Institute of Lisbon. And yeah, that's very bad of me having forgotten to mention them before. Sorry, but here comes. And well, so we are in perfect time. So once again, thanks Olivia and Gareth for perfect timekeeping. So we stop for 10 minutes. We come back at 3:40 for Ella Babalik, moderated by Andrea Pavoni. Like I said, I'm pausing recording now. We'll start recording again afterwards. And like I said, I repeat it, if someone prefers not to be mentioned in any way, please send me a private email or a private message, and I will make sure when we release, whatever the way we release the video, you're not going to be there. See you in 10 minutes. Yep.
Yeah, so we can start, I mean, without much further ado, the second session. I wanted just to say that, of course, you are free to write questions, but since this is already a pretty much alienating experience, I would really encourage you to talk, because at least let's hear each other's voices, yeah? So, but without much further ado, I'll leave the floor to Ella Babalik. I trust your time management skills, so I won't interrupt you. You have about 30 minutes.
Okay. I think I might take 20 minutes or so. Well, good afternoon. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And also thanks to all the organizers who brought us here. The first session has already been really interesting and really inspiring, with all the questions as well. So it will be a tough act, I guess, to follow that. I am Ella Babalik. I am a member of the academic staff at Middle East Technical University's Department of City and Regional Planning in Ankara, in Turkey. I must say that I will talk both about urban planning or urban form, urban developments, city life, city development, and also transport. As Simone already mentioned, I'm a transport researcher. So I guess I will focus a lot on urban transport, on mobility, how our mobility patterns changed and what that means. But also I must say that we cannot think of transport and urban mobility separate. We cannot consider them separate from urban development, from the rest of the city life. And therefore, I will try to draw as large a framework as possible. Let me start by sharing the presentation that I'm planning to give. Okay, we're there. So yes, I was asked to talk about researching urban futures, and I will try to raise questions throughout my talk actually, but particularly at the end of my speech, towards the end of my speech, a lot of questions about whether there are new paradigms emerging, whether there are new understandings emerging that's going to affect the way we are understanding cities and mobility, and whether that is going to change research. Now, obviously, the COVID-19, the coronavirus virus, had a major impact on our living conditions, but city lives are most affected. And in fact, urban mobility and travel behavior is possibly amongst the most drastically changed part of our daily lives. These drastic changes have made us, city planners and planning academics, to reconsider how we plan urban development and how we plan and manage urban accessibility and urban transport. So in this talk, first of all, I want to highlight how certain truths that we have accepted for urban planning and transport have been changing, have been transforming. And hence, whether we can talk about a paradigm shift in our way of understanding ideal urban growth patterns, or ideal mobility patterns, or ideal ways of planning urban areas and urban mobility. So therefore, let me first start by drawing a, I admit, very simplified framework in order to put across my points. A very simplified framework of what we as planners and planning academics consider ideal in city planning, in urban design, in urban mobility and accessibility. We can name various titles, various labels to describe mainstream contemporary approaches in city planning and urban mobility planning. We can use such descriptions or such titles as sustainable development, green developments, green cities, smart growth, smart city, energy efficient cities, energy efficient transport, environmentally sensitive urban development and transport, livable cities, healthy cities, just cities, social justice in city life and in urban accessibility, leading to the concept of accessibility for all. In addition to all these, we can talk about movements of new urbanism and transit-oriented development, and perhaps many more. They all correspond to a description of how cities could function best with minimum negative effect on the environment and on resources, and with maximum benefits for social justice, for public health, for quality of life. What this means for urban development, once again, in a very simplified way of describing, would be that we are talking about the importance of managing urban spatial growth, especially with a view to minimize prevailing patterns of urban sprawl. This has been on the agenda of planners and planning academics for such a long time. Growth management and dealing with urban sprawl, trends of urban sprawl. Of course, this is to protect and sustain ecologically sensitive areas and agricultural production, to minimize energy use and petrol consumption, to minimize the dependency on automobiles, to minimize costs of infrastructure developments that these sprawled and dispersed urban areas require. For mobility and accessibility, this also meant that managing urban travel demand was extremely important. Again, in order to reduce the demand to travel with motorized modes, so that this could help reduce energy use and reduce emissions. Also to shift the travel demand from automobiles to public transport and non-motorized modes, such as walking and cycling. Again, this would result in a reduction in energy use and reduction in emission, as well as reduction in congestion. And also, always an integral part of any mobility or accessibility debate would be accessibility for all, inclusive design, inclusivity of designing or planning accessibility. All of these leads to such discourses as compact cities. Compact cities take a large part of the discourse on these sustainable urban growth patterns or sustainable mobility, sustainable transport. But also many alternatives are discussed to the compact city, such as the corridor city, the linear city, the network of self-sustained settlements, etc. At the heart of them, there is generally the 3 Ds, density, diversity, and design. Like high density has been promoted as opposed to low density dispersal or sprawl. Diversity, in other words, mix of different land uses, has been supported, promoted, so that distances between different urban activities are minimized and we can offer citizens the opportunity to walk. A concept also described and labeled as accessibility by proximity. Then design, such as transit-oriented development or design for pedestrian-friendly urban areas, so that more public transport usage and walking is encouraged. In addition, with such design approaches, we can create living streets, vibrant public places, vibrant public squares for the social interaction of the citizens as well. Over the time, these 3Ds have been further elaborated as 6Ds with the addition of another 3. Distance, again, a major focus here is on the accessibility by proximity, destinations, demand management, all of them dealing perhaps more specifically with the transport part, with the urban accessibility part. And altogether, these have offered us a set of policy action areas, which I will summarize in only one slide. So once again, I am underlining that I'm trying to simplify things, perhaps oversimplifying them, but it will help to describe how they have been drastically changing. And we can, yes, talk of urban growth management as a major policy action area, urban design, both for minimized dependency on automobiles and for creating livable streets, living streets, shared spaces, accessible, vibrant public squares and public places. Then investment in and policies for encouraging public transport systems, policies for encouraging biking, policies for encouraging walking, which would include creation of high quality sidewalks that would be inclusive, that would provide accessibility for all, pedestrianized city squares or pedestrianized areas in the city with high public space function, once again shared streets, shared spaces. And generally, it has also always been agreed upon for decades now that in cities, particularly in congested central parts of cities, certain management approaches and restrictions should be brought on automobile usage. This could be like travel demand management or traffic management through physical restrictions or such pricing schemes as the congestion charging, or any car parking schemes or car parking management approaches. Then from March 2020, all these approaches, which we could even have labeled as universal truths in a way, have been altered. Now, what can we say about compactness right now? High density residential areas have become really undesirable due to the virus risks, and crowded streets in these high residential areas that threaten the required safe distancing. On the other hand, houses with gardens proved to provide cleaner open air opportunities and became a major advantage also for the lockdown periods. These houses with gardens are generally a feature of what I described as urban sprawl, as the dispersed urban form. They're generally at the outskirts, at the periphery of the cities. So what future for the compact city argument? What future for urban sprawl, despite all the perceived negativities associated with this trend of spatial growth? We are now seeing the advantages of it, or the citizens are seeing advantages of it. So how are we going to deal with that? How about planning and design to reduce automobile dependency? Automobiles are perceived as the safest mode right now during the pandemic because of the hygiene concerns. And then how about this idea of diversity of uses to minimize distances so that people can walk? Residential areas with mix of other uses have been now perceived unsafe. Again, due to the safe distancing that is required also between houses and shops, houses and health centers, or crowded post offices, banks. Whereas perhaps a year ago, this was described as the ideal neighborhood. Now residents are not happy to have these functions in walking distance to themselves. So what future for such approaches as the new urbanism, diversity, mix of land uses, etc.? And what is the meaning of distance and proximity now? It is definitely changing. I will revisit this. I'll come back to this meaning, changing meaning of distance towards the end. Planning and design for living streets, for vibrant public squares, public places. How about this policy? Crowded squares are to be avoided during the pandemic. Publicness and socializing started also to change meaning. Virtual meetings and socializing events took place. We are in a virtual meeting right now, but perhaps more surprising was the virtual socializing events, even pubs and bars opening up and inviting their customers on Zoom meetings, on virtual Zoom meetings. So what future for the social functioning of cities, for the meaning of city and city life? And what is the changing meaning of publicness, or the value of publicness? Is the value that we attach to public space changing? This meaning of publicness varies from public place to, of course, public modes of transport. And from there, I will move on to the validity of policies for encouraging public transport. Are they still valid? In the days of the pandemic, public transport has proved to be the most vulnerable transport mode, definitely. Crowded vehicles, crowded stations and stops were to be avoided, are to be avoided in order to keep personal safe space and distance. Certain precautions have been taken in most countries to provide for this safe space in public transport and also for hygiene in public transport. But regardless of that, there is a strong move away from public transport in most countries. So what future for public transport systems? And can we afford to emerge from this pandemic with totally collapsed systems of public transport? When I mean afford, I'm also talking about whether we can afford this, thinking of possible effects on congestion and on emissions, on energy use, on climate change. But also there's another question: what future for captive public transport riders? Here we are also touching on that issue of poverty, equality, social justice, some issues that have already been underlined and discussed in the first session here. But there are always those who have no access to alternative means of transport. So how about their future for accessibility, those dependent on public transport systems? And then what future for paratransit informal systems? In the first session too, there has been some talk about the different contexts in developing countries. From time to time, I will talk about that. Me, myself, coming from Ankara, Turkey, a country, for example, where paratransit informal systems exist. These are also part of the informal economy, and they make up an important part of the employment as well. So what future for them? Here are some pictures from India's auto rickshaw, but mostly the cycle rickshaws. Not only the lockdown period, but also immediately afterwards, any regulations to do with safe distancing, hygiene, etc. These left drivers out of job and without a livelihood. So what's future for the urban economy when we are looking at it only from this point of view, although there are so many other aspects to consider regarding the job crisis during the pandemic. In Turkey, we have informal minibus services shown in the picture above. The one below is from Kenya, so a similar system. These are not irregular, they are regulated, but they're regulated with severe difficulty. And you can see what I mean here. So one of the pictures again from Kenya about the situation in waiting in the minibus stops of these informal systems. And the two other pictures are from Turkey, from Istanbul, where actually during a time when these services are regulated for safe space and hygiene. This is what's happening during that regulation, so extremely difficult to regulate. Then again, there are very well regulated systems too. This is the Metrobus system in Istanbul, the bus rapid transit, which is run by the city authority. So it's not an informal system. On the other hand, these pictures show you the typical high demand for public transport in any developing country city. So combined with those who need to have access to public transport, who have no other options of access, we have these pictures during a pandemic as well. And this is from New Delhi, India. And the resulting conditions for travel. So how about their accessibility and, let's say, their quality of life in terms of public health in the city? Let me move on to policies for encouraging walking. Perhaps this is one area where the pandemic could be helping the policies of encouraging walking. That is because the initial statistics showed there was a move towards non-motorized modes, including walking and cycling, in the current times, not only because of their personalized mobility character, but well, what I mean by this is personalized mobility character helps control the personal space, but also because they are active modes of transport. They present an opportunity for exercise in the face of health concerns associated with staying indoors. And indeed, the pandemic also showed that people were becoming more prepared now to take longer walks in reaching their destinations, both because of that exercise aspect, because they also feel like they can help control their personal safe space when they are walking. Of course, this is only true if you're talking about uncrowded and safe walking paths. These should be available in cities. Good quality, safe, continuous, barrier-free sidewalks. Do all cities have them? Once again, unfortunately, these are pictures from Ankara, from where I live. So these are the conditions for pedestrians. These pictures are from a main city boulevard in the heart of the city, not an urban arterial outside the city. So these are the conditions for those who opt to walk for personal space, etc. And there are severe capacity, but also safety concerns here. And also very common in our cities, not only in Turkey, but also in many developing country cities, sidewalks occupied by parked cars, and these are the conditions of the pedestrians. Well, looking at those parked cars, but also boulevards and city streets taken over by automobile use in many cities, what happens to policies for discouraging automobile use? Are they relevant? Restrictions on automobile usage? Again, early statistics show that car usage, in comparison to the usage of other modes, particularly, of course, public transport, increased sharply in 2020. This was, to a certain extent, because those people who owned a car and were instead using public transport changed their mode choice and starting using their cars because they were safer in terms of health and hygiene. But in addition to that, more important is that there is an increase in car ownership. Car sales increased sharply in many countries, but particularly developing countries, where car ownership levels have generally been lower. This is an irreversible trend. That is the important thing. Once a car is purchased, then it is used. And afterwards, changing demand to public transport again is extremely difficult. What does this mean for energy consumption in the near future, for carbon dioxide emissions, for climate change, for congestion? Once again, I want to highlight that this is not a one-time phenomenon that will end after the COVID-19. The increased car ownership and consequent usage will stay with us. On the other hand, not everyone has a choice of using a car. This I had already mentioned. Some are being negatively, very negatively affected in terms of accessibility by the current and possible future conditions of accessibility. And we can talk particularly about the elderly, mobility impaired, low-income citizens, but also anyone with limited access to cars in general are exposed not only to health risks associated with the virus, but also to extremely reduced options for mobility. This has been going on for more than 8 months without much improvement in conditions. Also, those vulnerable groups who had limited access to cars or who had no access to cars became even more vulnerable because of the job crisis during the pandemic. What I want to highlight here is, while these conditions acted as a motivation for some people to purchase cars, whereas perhaps in the past they were not prioritizing that purchase, at the same time, it was impossible for certain people to be able to purchase cars because they lost their jobs during this pandemic. Now I am coming to the last section of this talk. With these new contemporary trends in our daily lives, in our cities, in our mobility habits, what research areas emerge? What factors will remain with us even after the pandemic? Well, the title was Amid a Pandemic, but I want to highlight constantly that some of the trends are staying with us that will require further research. And what factors make it difficult for us right now to establish research frameworks that will remain intact? I will try to raise many questions. I don't have answers to them. And I am also just trying to spark debates here. So I don't have an exact answer for all of those, but there are possibilities. So it is a mere exercise of brainstorming, let's say, and I will be looking forward to what you think of those questions, those points. Are we looking now into new paradigms for urban morphology? Do we need to revisit debates of compactness versus sprawl? Do we need to revisit the concepts and approaches of that 3D, density, diversity, design? They all aimed at creating reduced distances in cities in order to reduce dependency on motorized modes. But alternatively, is there a new paradigm emerging now that makes distance and physical accessibility irrelevant? This might also result in new paradigms and theories for residential relocation. We have seen that living and working and studying, even in different cities and different countries, have become possible and acceptable. So what does this mean? A new meaning of distance. How is this going to affect cities, urban lives, and transport, mobility, working habits, houses, as I said, residential relocation? Are we looking into new paradigms for public space? Or more importantly, are we revisiting the value and importance of public spaces in cities? How about this new meanings of social interaction and the new connotations to consider for the word public, because it is sometimes used even as a negative thing. That place is too public. You should avoid those places. Is this a fall of public spaces, a fall of street life, which we valued so much? An end to the understanding of public transport as the most sustainable mode of transport, because it was considered most sustainable because of its energy efficiency, because it was relatively more environmentally friendly, and it was the mode that provided accessibility for all. It was the inclusiveness, not the exclusivity. That brings me to the understanding of sustainable mobility then. Are we having new paradigms? Are we going to work on new theories for sustainable mobility? Looking at particularly the descriptions I made for urban mobility, there is definitely a new individualism emerging with the concept of safe distancing. This could be also renamed as a move from public to private. Private could also mean individual or personal. So these individual, personal modes of travel are favored over any collective public transport systems or even shared systems. This has implications for shared streets and shared spaces, of course. It also has implications for all these shared systems of car share, bike share, e-scooter share, demand responsive services, which were all emerging as a new area under the smart city concept, sometimes referred to as mobility as a system. And these were using digital technologies, smart city technologies, providing opportunities for people to use these systems without owning a vehicle. So it was usage without ownership. But now all of these are becoming vulnerable because people are a little bit skeptical about sharing any vehicle that has been used by someone else whose health conditions that they do not know. And then the autonomous cars that were arriving, which are also based on a system share concept. The autonomous cars could be also a car that was used half an hour by someone else. So what does this mean for these future technologies arriving? We are all talking about health, but our healthy city descriptions, concepts, and approaches were not exactly what we're talking right now. Of course, there are various issues regarding the virus risk and hygiene that have implications for the design and planning of open air systems, green area systems, their continuity in cities. Never new concepts, but they have received more attention. But in addition to them, in terms of talking about health, there are those who are working and learning from distance, who are confined indoors with very limited chances of exercise, suffering from related health risks, and research already found increased risks of obesity in school children since March 2020. So this is another important area of intervention or action or research. This could, of course, be interpreted as a new opportunity for the renaissance of walking and cycling, because they are always known as the active modes of transport. But how about the sharp increase in automobile ownership and usage at the same time? That has always been associated also with health risks and obesity, extensive automobile usage. So how are we going to reconceptualize the healthy city under these conditions? And how to solve the inherent problems of justice and equity. They have been deepened in the current conditions. Those who live in high-density central areas suffer more from virus-related health risks. And I already mentioned that those who are captive riders of public transport, who are dependent on public transport, suffer from similar health and hygiene concerns. Another equity issue that has been discussed for not related with only transport or city life is that there are those who have limited access to computers and internet during this period of distance working and learning. They are another component of the population that have become more vulnerable ones. Of course, in addition to that, I should add what has been discussed in the first session, that I completely agree. There are also those who do not have the option of working from home, and they have to continue working under these conditions. There is definitely an inefficiency of top-down policies. There is so much regulation. And also in the first speech, it was also mentioned these authoritarian approaches during this period increased. Those top-down policies mostly addressed issues to or areas to regulate hygiene or safe distancing, etc. But they have almost all failed to address issues of justice, equity, the job crisis. Whereas bottom-up initiatives for the local community has been seen. So how about their effects, and what will be the future of them? These are, I think, interesting research questions emerging. And of course, as a transport person, I have to talk about urban freight too. This is something that we don't always consider when we're talking about urban life, cities, and transport. But in fact, that has been a major area that has also been changing. A major increase in deliveries during this period we have experienced. Online shopping and delivery has increased, but this online shopping is also a behavioral change that may prove to be irreversible. Once you get used to it, it can be used, it can replace the shopping trips, and then how to handle this increased demand for delivery. Some researchers are emphasizing drones combined with concerns of hygiene of the person who delivers your goods using drones. And then this emergence of drones as a service is now receiving so much attention, but I think so much attention without not enough attention on the consequences, such as noise effects, visual effects, issue of privacy due to sensitive images captured by the camera on those drones during their delivery process. These are issues to consider, but I will end with the final slide, combining some of the things that I have highlighted. These new meanings of distance combined with possible erosion of the meaning of publicness, the new meanings and methods of socializing, our new understanding of reduced needs to travel for work, for school, for shops, and even for social interaction. Are we looking into new paradigms for urbanization and de-urbanization? Is there a migration back to the rural, not only to the countryside, as discussed in the first session here, not only to the countryside, which is perhaps an option considered by the wealthier, but back to the rural for other job opportunities for the rest of the urban society? Are we going to see the fall of megacities, major metropolitan areas? Are we going to reconsider our concept of scale for urban areas? Will there ever be confidence in the concept of healthy city after these experiences? And will this result in the fall of the very concept of cities? I will stop here. I don't mean to be pessimistic with any of these questions. These could be exciting openings to new futures. But as I said, I don't have the exact answers to all these, but I try to highlight as many points that I could think of in order to start a good discussion. And I am sure that there are so many more questions and points that you can highlight. So I'm looking forward to your reactions and your thoughts about this. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Ella, can you remove the video so we can see all the... Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. Actually, there are not many others points available because your talk really cover an incredible amount of questions. So I will open the field to questions, first of all. Please. Yeah, Olivia.
Wow, thank you, and thank you, Andrea, for the opportunity to kick off the discussion. But I felt that your talk was with great care, but potentially the flip side of the openings that Gareth tried with some difficulty to give us, right? It's sort of, he tried to point us in a direction that can be, if not hopeful, at least with some potential to be shaped in another direction, yeah? And I felt, although you have been incredibly careful in the way you presented your arguments and the data that is behind it, that you were pointing us to a closure and what I think in some of the jargon we call the lock-in factor. So the case of cars is a perfect and quite tragic example, I would say, having worked in mobility a long time ago, but still certain things are true, have been true for decades. And this return of the car with a literal vengeance is of great concern, I think. Not only, I would say, for the immediate environmental discourse around climate change or air pollution and health, but also in the way that some of us were perhaps overly optimistically thinking that we were seeing the possibility of recapturing a vast amount of public space for a different use. And suddenly I see all these doors. I mean, I just came back from Milan and just, you know, talking to my friends, I was hearing things like that the local government had actually tried to use the opportunity of the pandemic to open up roads for bicycles. And my friends who live in the center were saying, well, what we're noticing is an incredibly aggressive attitude of drivers resenting being narrowed in their space. So of course, this is just speaking to friends, but it was just, it easily pictures a somewhat dystopic, well, not a very happy thing, but I just wanted to pick up on the lock-in factor that you've pointed to and wonder, yeah, what can we do about it? Well, it's an impossible question, sorry, it's more a comment or.
Well, thank you for that comment. I am also concerned and very worried about the return of the cars with a vengeance, as you put it. I like that. I like that sentence. Yeah, it is likely what is happening, and it is also going to make cities even more unlivable. I am very much concerned about that aspect of it, but I also try to put some of the more optimistic parts about walking, but not all optimistic. Again, thinking of the pictures that I showed you about the conditions of walking in my city, for example. I think perhaps some bottom-up initiatives, even for that, for reclaiming the streets, could be seen in the future. But currently the concerns for the virus and the hygiene are so much more important that we can't even find the common ground to discuss how this car dependency is really threatening the near future, because the near future and the current is very much captured, let's say, by the concerns, by these health concerns. So I'm not very optimistic there.
Thank you. Any other questions, comments, experiences?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I can also comment the situation in Barcelona about that. Because of the pandemic, many walking paths have been widened. So sometimes, as Olivia was mentioning, invading, let's say, the cars path. Here, the city is since a long time trying, let's say, to relatively significantly diminishing the automobile traffic. So from my point of view, there wasn't that harsh reaction against this reduction of cars path. And the other thing that I saw is that here social movements are now asking for the increasing on numbers of public transport units because of safety. And I think that is also an important point. I mean, it could be another way to see the thing, and on many aspects. So people is again claiming for more public services on many points of view, from housing to transport. So they basically say that if the number of units is increased, for people it's easier to maintain distance, and public transport would be safer. So that could be also a question if you have been going through this kind of issue.
Perhaps also discussing the differences with, let's say, more Western European and North American countries and the developing world is also important in that sense. I know about the Barcelona case, and it is a good practice in many senses, in terms of the pedestrian experience, the trend for restricting cars for decades. I think there is good experience on that, and so there are there could be issues of these, let's say, more bottom-up movements again, requiring better services from the municipalities, from the city authorities, but it all comes down to whether the city authorities have the financial resources to be able to answer that. Perhaps generalizing the whole world as developed and developing is not correct either. I'm generally not for that. I'm generally against doing that categorization. But on the other hand, I think during this pandemic, this was one of the things that we have seen. The governments with limited resources have resulted in urban or have led the urban societies to suffer more. Right now, in major cities of Turkey, for example, I cannot envision more buses being purchased, more frequent services, more personnel costs to be committed to improve the services in order to improve social distancing, etc. So I am not extremely optimistic on that issue too, I have to tell you, but perhaps still more optimistic on the bottom-up initiatives that could really make the governments react to that.
Yeah, Simone.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Ella, for pushing us to think on all these connections. And I think this conversation is quite interesting. And I mean, from my perspective, from Lisbon above all, but with some Southern European perspective, so to speak, I think that this, what you were saying, you know, about which could be generalized as a complete failure by most governments to actually deal, at the very least, with the transportation side of this equation, with many more, but let's stick on the transportation. Yeah. I mean, the fact itself that, you know, the number of runs of trains, of tubes have been reduced at the same time as it was obvious that they should have been increased, and that virtually all local governments in Southern Europe, but I think in the UK it's not very different, have no resources whatsoever since long time to do what will be necessary. And so this brings me to reflect, yeah, that most of what you have described is some phenomena happening in the market, so to speak, in the effects on the markets, on the economy of lockdown measures, without any sort of capacity of most governments, Western governments, in this regard. And I mean, we could go for some length. For instance, say in Asia, it has been much different. In Eastern Asia, we have seen a much stronger capacity of governments, both local and national, to actually interpret this crisis. Again, even if we just look at the field of transport, And I'm not going to get into what it means to compare so-called democratic and so-called not democratic governments. But in this sense, I mean, I'm really concerned and that this somehow marks the end, the symbolic end of the capacity of European government, at the very least, to actually govern. And it also means, yeah, maybe after these things will change, but it also means losing credibility. And it also has purchase on the way that citizens react to lockdowns. For instance, while in March and April, we've seen more or less everybody agreeing to the lockdown measures because it was the generalized perception that it was necessary. Now in this so-called second wave, I think that one of the reasons why we are witnessing more and more people being not accepting measures may be linked to the perception that at the same time, the same governments were asking us to stay home, have done nothing in this field. I mean, even the smallest thing, for instance, buses are still with no windows. We have buses with no windows and no one has thought, oh, wait, how can we use simple, easy economic ways to open up buses and have air come inside? And yeah, sorry, I started rambling around on this, but I just wanted to push some concern in this direction.
Yeah, just to, it wasn't a question, it was a comment. Thank you for that. But just to also further build on that, I agree. I think what has been experienced by the citizens, by the people, is sort of loss of belief in the governments, thinking that many of the regulations or decisions, policies regarding the regulations are really prioritizing economic concerns rather than the health concerns. So there is a possible loss of credibility, which is going to have major impact on urban politics, but also I think central government politics, even EU policies. I don't know. It will be interesting to see.
Just on this, I want just to pick up on the question of Asian countries, and I don't know whether you have studied them or indirectly, because of course when we talk about Asian countries, especially China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, South Korea, we talk about countries that already experienced pandemics, epidemics, local epidemics for the last 30 years. So of course, I mean, on the one hand, it's not surprising that they're much more prepared on the one hand. On the other, of course, a lot of things can be said. So on what they did. And so, for example, talking about transport, mobility, and use of public more generally, but trying to keep it a bit more specific, because otherwise it's really hard to make question about everything from health to, from so just focusing on this matter, whether you see differences in how they are reacting now, and also and positive or negative on this matter, and also if they did, of course, I realize that you may even not know this matter because you're not supposed to know about all the world, of course, but if you know whether after their epidemics, SARS, avian flu, etc., there was significant changes on these aspects or not. So that's the question.
I know about Asian countries and their urban development dynamics or transport behavior to a certain extent, but I have not studied or read much about how their governments reacted after or during the emergence of the pandemic. So that second part is difficult for me to answer, but I can share some thoughts. In general, the cities of the developing world have the perhaps advantage or flexibility of a better distribution of usage of different modes of transport. There are those who are, yes, driving, and that is increasing. Car ownership and car usage is increasing, but still there has always been a lot who have been using public transport, but more important than that, who were dependent on non-motorized modes. Perhaps this dependency is a negative word, but it also brings a sort of a flexibility. Of course, the increased share of walking and cycling, particularly in the Asian cities, cycling is an important mode of transport. This, of course, comes again with those reduced distances. Or let's say not reduced, but distances that have not grown over the years due to urban sprawl, etc. Those cities have generally been more compact, which is again due to lack of much car ownership and perhaps lack of very good public transport systems. So at the end, that brings a flexibility that there is not a major dependence on cars, as most of the more industrialized and developed world, or there is not a major dependence on public transport, as is the case in Turkey. We have walking and cycling almost non-existent. Walking has reduced so much over the last decades. So I think having a better distribution of different modes being part of the daily life could be helpful, could have helped, but I don't have the exact answer for that. But also, having said that, many of the issues that I underlined about increased uptake of automobiles, increased usage, are much more alarming for the developing world, because the Asian countries, cities, or Latin American, South American cities, as well as Turkey, we had already been experiencing a high rate of increase in our car ownership levels, but relatively we always had lower levels of car ownership and car usage. Now this has been a major additional push for more car ownership and then more car usage. And with, in fact, this relatively lower car ownership and car usage, our cities in the developing world were already suffering significantly from congestion and air pollution and related health issues. So what the coming years will bring is, well, it is quite alarming, yeah.
Thanks. Just a follow-up. And what about the possibility on the other end of implementing teleworking, I mean, smart working in a much more, I mean, because of course, discussion about smart working usually in this period are always a bit dystopic, but actually it's a great opportunity. I mean, for a lot of people that, for instance, have to commute 2, 3 hours, 4 hours every day, and this is really horrible. And of course, again, it goes to increase congestion in the streets and pollution. So don't you see in this, because I see the point on car is very good that you make, the fact that car is really irreversible. Once you buy a car, you got a car. So it's not something. So you see a possibility to actually have a transition. I mean, not necessarily total smart working, but a lot of companies are talking about 2 days at a week in the office, stuff like that, and how this could counteract your pessimistic in these countries, but also more generally.
I think a universal issue, you're right. These ICT, information communication technologies, have been on the agenda for so long for describing sustainable futures, for sustainable urban transport, sustainable cities, because they were seen as a way of reducing the need to travel. But they have always been approached with a little bit of suspicion. Are they really realistic? When people do not take the commuter trips, the morning and evening work trips, the school trips, are they going to make other trips more often? So is it really going to be a reduction in trips? There was all these discussions, and this period really showed us what it means from that also it is possible to work from home, to attend schools from home. Yes, we have seen those, but whether they have a good effect on the quality of our lives, I'm really not sure, as someone who is now working in front of a computer all day doing teaching or attending meetings. there is that. The quality on education is also an issue that is being discussed. But to answer your question, I definitely see that this experience will stay with us. Hybrid systems, or, you know, as you said, possibilities for taking some of the days, working some of the days from home, doing some of the teaching as distance learning, distant teaching. I think those possibilities now have been experienced, and they are very likely to stay with us. And this could have an effect on reducing the need to travel, definitely. But again, referencing to some of the discussions of the first session, not every job in a city can be carried out from home with teleworking.
Do we have more questions, or even just a specific personal example? Yeah, please.
I can
please, yeah.
add something. Thank you for your talk, Ella. Just to I just received like your input about dystopian city, and just two jokes I would like to share in the chat. A funny picture of Wall-E. I don't know if you remember this movie where in a dystopian future city, human become fat people who don't share anymore any kind of public space, and the only kind of mobility is inside a small individual car. It's just a joke, just in order to remember us, to remind us how much it's beautiful to believe in the importance of public space and the importance of other way to live the public space. And on this topic, I would like to add some perspective from my personal perspective as a researcher who is working in a city in the south of Europe, specifically in Catania in Sicily. And during the pandemic period, so far, so also now, I'm working in some very, bad neighborhood of the city. And I would like to shed light on the fact that those areas are the one in which you have more lack of public space, like green, but generally good quality of life. And this is also in the private buildings. So usually people living in this bad neighborhood, in this distressed area, are also the people who don't have so much, a big house. They don't have a lot of possibility to live with a good quality of life. So probably one very critical point is this is a justice topic that is very important to focus. So we already approached this topic during this conversation. You were Ella, you were talking about the bottom-up practices. I was also asking something before about this, because I really believe that the bottom-up practices were the ones that during the lockdown were trying to answer with self-helping, with mutualism, mutual help to these problems that were emerging. But there are two critical points on the bottom-up practices that actually, for at least two. One is the resource, the economic resource. We know that there is this problem when you are you are a civic society, you organize yourself through an association, grassroots movements. Anyway, there will be that point in which you don't have any more money or possibility to really organize yourself in a good way. And another problem, very huge one, is the restrictions coming from the government. Right now, there are so many restrictions that you cannot, even if you want to, you cannot so much help each other, or you cannot so much really mobilize the civic society. So there is, for sure, there are these two limitations. But anyway, even if there are all these limitations, it's true, and I believe really that the bottom-up in the face of the problem that Simone was talking before about the incapacity of the local government to really use the money in order to support the weak sector of society. It's true that the bottom-up movements or practices were the ones that really try to support and help the weak sector of society. This was not a question, actually. Also, was just it was a comment in line with the previous comments. But thank you.
You're right. You're right. I agree with both of the points you made. I agree that the bottom-up approaches are not necessarily always going to work. They cannot be the only answer. And yes, they may not have the capacity or the financial resources. But secondly, what you said first, I think in all this story, in all this experience, this issue of inequality is really one of the most important issues for research, for action, for discussion. Hopefully, some interventions will go there.
Yes, Olivia.
Unmute myself. I could not resist. I wanted to follow up on Lizzie's very funny screenshot of that cartoon Wall-E, and I'm going to share with you something that I wanted to share when on our initial talk with Gareth. The very short story by E.M. Foster, of all places, and authors. In 1909, he wrote something called The Machine Stops. And if you're not familiar with it, I highly recommend it, because it envisages an unfortunately dystopian future. And Wall-E was partly inspired by that story, but the story is phenomenal, and it really eliminates completely all public space, all transport, because people do not move, and all physical contact. And it's only 20 pages long, and it's absolutely amazing. So for some inspiration about what might come if we continue to follow certain storylines about what is happening to us. Sorry, that was...
Thank you. Thank you for that. I didn't know about it. Thank you. Great. I think there's a question on the chat.
Yeah, did you read it, or shall I?
I'm reading it, but if you want, read it for everyone.
Yeah, it's I mean, it's about it's from Sophie Melix, and it's from Berlin, and it's about the question of climate change, basically, and also the role it has in the discussion before and after, and it's still keeping the same role in the discussion around the pandemic and the issue you were talking about.
Yeah, the point here is climate change was the basis for most discussions until the start of the pandemic, and it is sort of forgotten, I think, is the point here, that it should continuously be included in address, talking about mobility and planning measures. Of course, I completely agree. All the trends that I tried to mention, and not just only the car ownership and car usage, but also this move towards the let's say periphery of the cities, to the houses with gardens, moving away from the high density city center. But in addition to that, even moving away from the cities to the countryside, all of these will have an effect on the environment, on energy consumption, on consumption of land, on conversion of natural land to built environments. All of those have major effect on climate change, obviously. You're right, I agree.
Do we have any more questions? Otherwise, I will keep talking, yeah? So please. If there are no questions, no, I just wanted to make actually come back to what we were saying before, but just to make a link with also Gareth's point about and what I was discussing before about when I was making a question about on the one hand, the importance of corporal experience, etc., this aspect. I'm not reducing all Gareth talk to this, but just speaking this point. And on the other end, what we're discussing now. And I think we should probably, and I want to make a point and then see what you think about it. We should probably not overestimate our experience as academics, because of course, probably we are the least impacted, not only in economical sense, blah, 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 but really in our routine. Yes, teaching, of course, enormous, but it's much more for the students than for who teach, but that's one part of it. But our work as researcher is very little impacted comparing with the other. So of course, we tend to really champion a kind of, oh, let's go back to the streets, etc., etc. And this is completely agree, etc. But on the other end, we should not underestimate the power of technology to actually let people go back to the street, which I mean, if you don't have to travel 4 hours per day, then you can go to the street to do your social life. If at 5 p.m. you finish work and you are not home at 8 p.m., but you can be home at 5.1, it makes a huge difference. This is not, of course, to fall into technocracy, not at all, but to keep into account that for many people, the experience of going to work and coming back to work is the most horrible experience of their own life. So this is also something we need to keep into account.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. The elimination of that travel can open up quality time for us, definitely. But I will just say this, half joking, let's say, what we have been experiencing with the teaching from home it is sort of opening up time for more meetings being imposed on us. I don't know how to deal with that. Perhaps you are experiencing a similar thing, because there is now this knowledge that we're working from home, so we're available all the time.
Yeah, on this I completely agree.
Can I say something?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say that I don't agree with Andrea when he said that our lives haven't changed that much. Because as a...
No, but I say I haven't changed that much comparing to other. That changed a lot, of course.
Well, yes, because from my point of view, since I'm an anthropologist, my way of doing research has been compromised. So in fact, it has changed a lot. Only the part when I'm reading and writing articles or attending seminars or meetings, that part has remained mostly the same. But the research part, which I think is something we need to reflect upon, and we need to do some thinking about. I think it has changed a lot. So I don't agree with what you said in total. That's just what I want to say.
Yeah, okay. I mean, yeah, I can clarify, but we will at some point agree through clarification. But let's leave the floor if there is some very last question, because we are about to close.
Andrea, Duygu was raising a hand, I saw, but yeah.
Yeah. Yes. But it was more of a follow-up. I think the topic was already passed. Sorry, I couldn't turn on my video. Apologize for that. The point that Ella Babalik just made about this urban morphology discussion, and especially this compact city, I think we should also consider this user perspective, from a user perspective, how social life is actually unfolding. Because although we are also social beings, okay, we are also living this with the entire population, I think we somehow look at things from a rather pessimistic manner, because I believe, and I want to believe, this idea about living in densities shouldn't be the discussion that much if we focus on the actual social user, because people as social beings, they will still, I think, prefer to live together. And this density issue that was brought up in some of the academic circles, I think it's somehow problematic, because maybe you would remember in New York case, the cases in and around Manhattan, the cases were discussed like, okay, these are the most dense areas, and the urban, morphology is enabling this quick spread. So we should maybe think about further dispersal, like urban sprawl. But it was also a very important input to consider these income level differences, and the people, as Ela Babalik also mentioned, that they didn't have the chance to work from home. They were actually being infected, being influenced by the spread further. So this idea about sprawl and complexity, maybe we are exaggerating it without looking at from a actual user perspective. And for another thing about this public space, maybe I really like in the presentation that you mentioned, maybe we should look for new let's say terminology for public space, which is coming hand in hand usually, open and public spaces. And again, from the user, like everyday user perspective, people want to be outside. And so this closeness to the open park or open, any other kind of space, including walking, will be still important. Maybe I extended, maybe the time is over, sorry for that, but I'm looking at from a more, trying to look maybe from a more optimistic perspective, and I would like to mention, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Duygu, for these contributions. They were exactly the questions I was asking, and you are saying that there could be new conceptualizations, there could be different ways of approaching this, and from which would result in more optimistic outcomes too. So yeah, thanks for that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think we are about to close, so I will pass the word to Simone if he wants to have some concluding remarks.
Well, what I can say is saying thank you to Ela and to Andrea. Once again, perfect timekeeping, but at the same time, great conversation, stimulating. So it was another interesting session, and in a way perfectly complementary to the previous, which was our goal. So I'm happy that this kind of worked out. And so in conclusion, I can just say that, yeah, we hope that in 1 year from now, more or less, we're gonna keep discussing together on urban futures after a pandemic. And yeah, for those in the audience that may have not been among those selected for the workshop, in fact, the idea is that most of the people are already been selected, but probably we're gonna have the possibility to open a few more slots. So keep an eye on the website of the Urban Transitions Hub and of AESOP Young Academics in case you're interested. And like I said, the recording of this session, we're gonna see whether we're gonna keep it internal or share it outside. I think it's an interesting conversation that can probably be put online in the sense that it's enough coherent, but then it's easier to see the video and then decide. To conclude, Rozana is not here anymore, but I don't know if Lizzie, she's from the coordination team of Young Academics, want to say a final word from them or not. Don't feel obliged if you want.
On behalf of the coordination team, I can say to everyone, thank you very much for the participation. And we are looking forward to see all of you in next events and next space of debates, meetings.
Thank you, Lizzie. So
very short.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks again to Joana, Catela, Carolina, Henriques, and Mariana Liz, who co-organized this event and the following and the future workshop with me and Rozana. And yeah, thank you very much. It was fun, and see you somewhere else and in better situation, possibly.
Thank you. Thank you for the organization. It has really been fun and very inspiring. Thank you for all the comments.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.